Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor K. Scott Wong, who's Professor of History at Williams College, where he teaches a variety of courses on Asian American history, American immigration history, history and memory, war and society, and the 60s. He has written numerous articles and is the author of Americans First, Chinese Americans in the Second World War. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I have to confess, Scott, history is probably not something I have studied a lot. And it's interesting to me. You know, I came to the U.S. in the mid-'80s to go to graduate school, and subsequently became an U.S. citizen. So I am the sort of a first-generation immigrant to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't really studied or thought a lot about immigration and immigration history. I know that you have a class at Williams around this. Could we rewind time a little bit, Scott, and go back? I know there have been waves of immigration into the US, some by choice, some without. And then in many cases, there were different reasons and different ways of treatment for immigrants, right?
Right. Yeah.
So what is what is the right point to start? To think about this huge waves of immigration that happen.
Okay. Well, I think there's two important things to keep in mind, and the first one is on the immigrant side of things, right? And I'm a firm believer that the majority of the time people do not want to leave their homes, right?
Yeah.
They if things were good in their home countries or in their home cities, they would stay. I mean, it's where they grow up, it's where your family is, it's where your food is, it's where your culture is, it's where your religion is. For some people, for some cultures, it's very important to, shall we say, take care of the graves of your ancestors. It's a certain obligation. And so on. I think in the modern world that has probably become less important for some people as they move around. But I do believe that people would prefer to stay at home, and not create a new life somewhere. And then on this side of the equation, let's say the American side, even though we are a nation of immigrants, or as Walt Whitman called it, a nation of nations, there's this tension between this desire for pluralism because of immigrants, and a simultaneous desire for homogeneity. That we welcome immigrants from all over the world so long as you get on the same page as everybody else. And I think, to a certain extent, that tension has been with us throughout American history. And they're both understandable, right? I mean, we talk about, like one of the mottos of America is out of many, one, right? But that one doesn't necessarily have to mean that everybody acts and believes the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, some people came to the U.S. against their will, certainly enslaved people. People who were already here, indigenous people, didn't necessarily want all these other people coming. And some people came to the U.S. not necessarily because it was the U.S. It was where the jobs were, So the Irish leave because of the potato famine in the 1850s. It's coincidentally, the Industrial Revolution in New England. Right? So all these factories are need labor and so on. And that's the truth, with agricultural work, right? At various times in our history, we lack people to pick crops and things like that. So people are encouraged to come to be agricultural workers, right? And then sometimes we even bring them in, we let them work for a while, then we kick them out,
And sort of a demand for labor by immigration, right?
Yes, labor is a huge reason why people come, and a huge reason why American companies recruit labor, from afar. And then the people who are already here, sometimes, I'd like to think that, we welcome new people. I always tell my students, when it comes to food, thank God for immigration. I mean, could you imagine if all we ate were, boiled mutton and potatoes, right? But a lot of other people, unfortunately, don't like what people bring with them. They bring their food, which I like, but other people don't, right? They also bring their religion. They bring their gender relations. They bring their views on anything, that it doesn't always match up with contemporary American society, and so there's always a little bit of tension.
But I have a quick question for you. So historically, when you look at this immigration waves, you mentioned the demand for labor sort of driving it. But from the American perspective, when the immigrants came, was the expectation assimilation? Because, if it was purely labor, it was sort of a temporary expectation, right?
Yeah. Well, I think at certain times, it was expected to be temporary. I don't think people in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s thought that these immigrants were going to be temporary.
Yeah.
Right. Certainly in the 1950s, when the government and business recruit Mexicans to come work, and even during the Second World War to bring Mexicans in, to work because other Americans are at war, I think they were hoping that they would be temporary and they would go home when no longer needed. And that's actually the same for during the Second World War, when men went to war, women went to factories, right?
Yeah.
And then there was that expectation that once the men came home from war, the women would go home, raise kids and so on. And, a good portion of the female population, once they tasted what it was like to work out of the home and to make a wage of their own, they didn't necessarily want to go home and be housewives.
Right.
And I think that, it's not talked about as much, but I think you see the seeds of the women's movement there that would happen, later.
Yeah. And so, the expectation of becoming a citizen of the country, it was different in different times, right? And I found it fascinating. There's sort of the criteria that was used in different times.
Right.
Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, the thing about citizenship is that there's a lot of advantages to citizenship, right? You can own land. There was a time where if you weren't a citizen, you couldn't own land. There was a time when if you were not a citizen, you couldn't own a gun, shall we say, right?
Yeah.
But I think one of the big things that's always been in the back of people's minds is that citizenship gives you equal rights to people, but it also gives you the right to vote.
Yeah.
And I think that has been a big problem for people who don't want immigrants voting. Right. And it for a while, they certainly, certain groups of Americans didn't want Catholics voting, right? Because they were afraid that the Catholics' loyalty would be to the Pope and not to the U.S., right? They didn't want Asians voting, because they weren't sure of their politics or their cultural values. I mean, they didn't want women to vote until 1920, right? Regardless of their immigration status, because they didn't think women were capable of understanding politics, and they certainly didn't want emancipated slaves to vote, because they numbered were they were large in number, and there was a certain fear that they wouldn't vote for their masters, or their former masters.
Yeah, so the voting was a sort of a very important consideration, and we even now that is what we see, right? This immigration bill that is not going anywhere is fundamentally driven by that fear, is it?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I honestly believe, and I don't want to go into this direction of politics for this, but right now, I think the Republican Party wants as few people voting as possible, right? Because they're afraid that the vast majority of Americans won't vote for them, right? Republican presidents have not won the popular vote. Donald Trump lost the popular vote twice. I think George Bush lost it the first time. Not sure, but they don't want a lot of people voting because a lot of their policies just don't match up, or a lot of their rhetoric doesn't match up.
Right. And again, historically, race and color of the skin were important criteria for citizens.
Yes, they well, it's see, unfortunately, we are stuck with this concept of race.
Yeah.
Right. And that race becomes a matter of skin color, right?
Right.
And then everything that gets piled onto race, dark-skinned people have certain kind of cultures and so on and so forth. But Gill, this may interest you, and perhaps I'm telling you something that you already know, but in 1923, you have a very important Supreme Court case in which a South Asian, a Sikh, who was given American citizenship because he had served in the American Army during World War I. But then once, by 1917, South Asians were restricted from entering, and they also tried to limit citizenship to only white people and black people. And so when this man, his name was Bhagavat Singh, Mr. Thin. And when Thin went to the Supreme Court, he said, "I'm Caucasian." Right? He said, all the scientists say that South Asians are actually Caucasian because of centuries of intermarriage with people from what we now call the Middle East and so on, you know.
Right.
And they said to him, they said, well, the scientists say that, but look how dark you are. You know, no one would ever consider you Caucasian. And that sort of put the cap on, like, you know, Caucasian equaled white, you know. You know, and of course, all of these terms are fluid and they don't really mean anything anymore. But back then they did. And unfortunately, today they still do, you know.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Scott, I did, there was a program by National Geographic that you can send a saliva sample and using disease progression, you can trace your roots back, all the way back to Africa, to 50,000 years ago.
Right.
And in my case, so they will also show you a heat map of your genes. And before coming to the US, I had never left India. My family had never left India. But my heat map has the highest concentrations in Rome, Netherlands, and Spain.
Really?
On my dad's side. And on my mom's side, it's different.
Right.
And so you mentioned this idea of race. There is really no scientific basis for it. You know, from a genetic perspective.
Right.
Homo sapiens went through a bottleneck. I think the number of Homo sapiens at one point in time was only about 15,000 in the entire world. And so we have 8.4 billion clones right now. But most of our policies are based on this idea of race, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And we all know that race doesn't really exist, but we're unfortunately stuck with it for now. And I don't know how to get past it, you know.
Yeah.
And when I have students who say, yes, but, you know, race is just a social construct. And that only intellectually, that may be true. So I say, well, yeah, it's a social construct, but of grave consequence. You know, it's, you know, in some ways it's the same as nationality. You know, like when I ask my students what nationality are, they get confused with race. You know? And they wonder, and I try to tell them, well, in some ways, nationality depends on who you're a citizen of. But you can still call yourself Indian or you know, Peruvian, but you can be an American citizen. But, you know, we're unfortunately stuck with a language that doesn't meet the complexity of who we are as people, you know.
Yeah, and I found it hilarious, Scott. You talked about the South Asian Supreme Court case, and there was a similar one with a Japanese person, right?
Yes, right before him, and that was Ozawa, and he said he was white because of his skin tone was so light. You know, and they said, you're not what you may look white, but you're of a race that's ineligible for a citizenship. You know?
Right.
So by 1924, Asians are ineligible to citizenship. And they're also heavily restricted from immigrating, because the 1924 bill said if you can't become a citizen, then you can't immigrate. But that wasn't always enforced well, or people learned how to get around that legally or illegally. And then there was, you know, after the Second World War, you know, and after, you know, when Indian independence and so on, you know, people were allowed in regardless of their country of origin or race, because they came in as refugees. Right.
There was some important law in, was it 1882?
1882 was the Chinese Exclusion Act.
So what is the Chinese Exclusion Act? What was the
well, the Chinese Exclusion Act at this time, you know, 1882, there's a growing anti-Chinese movement in the U.S. A lot of it geared around economic competition, right? So it's post-Civil War, Black people are looking for jobs, white people are looking for work, and the Chinese show up in the 1850s in recognizable numbers because of the gold rush, and then the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act did two things. It prohibited laborers from entering the country for 10 years. And it also said that Chinese could never become citizens of the U.S. Oh, and it also said that laborers were not allowed to bring their wives and families. See, but merchants could. Right. So then you have a race and a class issue here, right? So it's like if they're merchants, we'll let them in, but if they're laborers, no. So which is why Chinatowns formed, and it's mostly merchants,
Yeah.
And those are the ones who are allowed in, and their wives are allowed in, and so it takes a long time, but there would eventually be American-born Chinese, mostly in that merchant class.
Was it an economic decision?
Yeah, I think to me it's a combination of three things, and these words don't always make sense either, right? But economics, yes, because 1880s, the U.S. is in depression. We're also trying to expand westward, and there's a fear that the Chinese will take all the jobs in the West, right? And then racially, they're not white. So there's a fear that the country will be then flooded with more non-white people. And then there's culture. Chinese were seen as very foreign. They didn't dress the same as other people. They spoke a language which no one could understand. They ate with sticks, and they ate weird food, and ironically, right, they ate weird food, and yet they would pioneer agriculture and commercial fishing and all on the West Coast. And as one author put it, there's now more Chinese eateries than all McDonald's, Burger Kings, and Kentucky Fried Chicken combined.
Yeah.
Right. And as she put it, we have this expression, as American as apple pie, and chances are you've had some kind of Asian food more recently than you've had a slice of apple pie.
Yeah, but the merchant class, they were treated differently, Scott, because they were sort of on the business side, had higher influence on economics.
Yeah, higher influence on economics, and to be a merchant, you also had to be somewhat literate, right? And because Chinatowns have always been seen as this isolated area, an exotic area, right?
Yeah.
But often, Chinatowns were actually multi-ethnic and multiracial, and so therefore merchants had to learn English. Because they had a mixed clientele, So, and as I said, they had to be somewhat literate in order to take inventory and to make orders. So they probably had some kind of education too.
And to make transactions happen.
Yeah.
So I want to shift gears and go to one of your papers.
Okay. Sure.
Conflicting images, contested terrain.
Mm-hmm.
You say ever since Chinese immigrants in America began forming communities in the mid to late 19th century, the residential, business, and cultural space, generally referred to as Chinatown, has been layered with imagery. These images, you say, largely negative and demeaning, have usually been framed by observers who did not live in Chinatown and who had little connection or stake in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get into the Chinatowns in America, Chinatown is not an American invention, right? We have Chinatown all over the world, don't we?
Yes. There are what you want to call, what you might want to call Chinatown. I think in Spanish it's Barrio Chino.
Yeah.
There's a I don't know what to say, a custom or a habit, but people live with their own kind for a while, right?
Mm.
So you move to a new country, and especially if there's a lot of people of your kind moving, then you move to what sociologists might call an ethnic enclave, right? So there's Little Italy's, there's Greek Town, right? On the West Coast, you have Little Saigon. Now, I don't know about South Asian communities, whether they're called Little Delhi's or something. I don't know, right? But it's and they formed for a number of reasons. You want to be around people who understand what you're saying. You want to be able to go into a store and buy the clothes that you want, or the food that you need, or religious articles, or things. And so there were Japantowns, Chinatowns, but there's also Germantown. There's Ukrainian neighborhoods. People tend to live around people with whom they are familiar. And in many cases, and I can't speak for other groups, but in many cases, Chinese formed Chinatowns with people that they immigrated with, so therefore they knew each other, and so they would live around each other. Also, it became very hard to live in other parts of the city because if you were Chinese, for the longest time, no one wanted you in an integrated neighborhood.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you. So, at least on the surface, I don't know much about this, Scott. At least on the surface, clumping of communities might slow down assimilation.
Yes.
But then the question is, was assimilation the goal?
Uh-huh.
I don't know. So do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think assimilation is sometimes more of the goal of outside society, right? Whereas people within Chinatown or Japantowns, they wanted to assimilate in a way that they could become American, but be Chinese American, and not necessarily have to reject everything that their parents and grandparents had brought with them, right? Now, at different times in history, and certainly individuals. I mean, we all want to fit in some way,
Yeah.
And so, if for early immigrants, it's easier to fit in, let's say, with your fellow countrymen, right? But once you've been here a while, or you immigrate, but your parents move to an all-white suburb, right? Then you have to find a way to fit in. Now, does that necessarily mean assimilate? Not necessarily, right? You can still be Hindu, you can still eat Indian food, but you might also become a really good baseball player.
I doubt that. Yeah.
Right. Although it's funny now, I have a number of South Asian and Lebanese American students who are on the squash team. So they assimilated somewhere along the line. But then squash, I don't know if squash is popular in India.
Squash is popular in India.
Oh, okay, there you go.
But these images that you describe, Scott.
Well, okay, there's Chinatown's dangerous, right? Yeah. It's exotic, it's dangerous. The early times was that, there's opium dens, there's a lot of crime. White women will get captured and sold into white slavery. You don't know what kind of meat they're serving in the restaurants, and so on. And, most of that had to do with simply because, early Chinese immigrants didn't speak English well, and maybe they were Buddhist or Taoist, and so they had incense going, and so on. And this was just, odd to Americans, So they had all these images as of this dangerous, exotic place, but they still kept going,
Yeah. And how has it changed? I know that the oldest Chinatown in the world is somewhere in Philippines or something, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
What is the oldest one in the U.S.? Which one is that?
Probably San Francisco.
San Francisco. That burned down though, right? And that will be
It burned down and was rebuilt, and it burned down in 1906 because of the earthquake.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they rebuilt Chinatown in the same place. The government of San Francisco wanted to put Chinatown elsewhere, and the Chinese said no. This is where we have lived. This is where we will rebuild.
Yeah, I heard a story. Not heard, but I think I read a story that said, yeah. So when Chinatown in San Francisco burned down, they wanted to essentially get rid of it. Till they realize that they're going to lose a lot of business.
Mm-hmm. Right. See, and that's the labor thing, right?
Right.
Money talks. And if there's that many places to eat Asian food in the country, then, they may not, some people may not like Asian food, or they may, have, negative feelings about Asian people, but the food is here to stay.
Yeah. And so the negative imagery that you talk about, how has it changed over time, last 100 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have to admit that, not living in a Chinatown now since I was a child, it's hard for me to say. But I still think that many people still do see Chinatowns as foreign to them. And that's simply because of that, a lot of people in Chinatown still speak Chinese. And that's because the one difference about Asian communities is that there's still ongoing immigration, right? So that new immigrants will come and continue to speak Chinese while their children and grandchildren move out of Chinatown, or the earlier generations move out and they speak only English, or they're bilingual. Right. But newer immigrants tend to, replenish the population with Chinese speaking people. Now, you don't see that in there are no little Italy. There might be little Italies in certain cities, but Italians don't live there anymore. There are restaurants, but they all live in other parts of the city or out in the suburbs, because there's no sustained Italian immigration going on.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview, Scott, and I think she was talking about Boston, Chinatown, and I don't know much about it, but she was saying that increasingly non-Chinese find the Chinatown or proximity to Chinatown real estate to be very attractive.
Right.
And so they move in, and over time, essentially, the original idea of culture and community and all of that disappear.
Yeah.
Because you don't have the Chinatown anymore.
Right. And unfortunately, many Chinatowns, people will always live in Chinatown.
Yeah.
Right? But their economy is still really based sometimes on the restaurant business, and restaurant business and small shops, and unfortunately sweatshops.
Right.
And that's a part of Chinatown and other ethnic communities that tourists don't see. And the owners of sweatshops don't want you to see that either.
Right. Sweatshops meaning making things on site.
Yeah, clothes
on site. So
yeah.
So much of the things that they sell are not imported; they're actually manufactured.
Well, I think less so now are they making them. I can tell you that New York Chinatown, a lot of the sweatshops closed after 9/11.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, a lot of Chinatown closed after 9/11 because that whole area of Manhattan was closed off. Right. So a lot of the garment industry, the sweatshops in which mostly women sewed by the piece, they all shut down. Right. And nowadays, we offshore all of our clothing almost. It may say made in America, but it's made in American Samoa or something. But you can even go to LL Bean, which used to be only American made, and now their things are made in Vietnam and all over the place.
Yeah. So what is the perception in China, Scott, about Chinatowns?
In China. I have to be honest with you, I don't know about contemporary China. I would think that people, affluent Chinese, let's say from Shanghai, might buy property in Chinatown, but they wouldn't live there.
For a business, business action, as an investment. Yeah. And so I guess increasingly, would it be correct in saying the original idea was more community and culture and perhaps language, allowing you to sort of mix with folks who can understand you? But would it be correct in saying increasingly it's about business? It's about economics.
Yeah, it's about business, or for new immigrants, it's a stepping stone.
Yeah.
It's a place to move into, get settled in America, sort of maybe open a restaurant, or work at a restaurant, make do in order to provide a better life for your children, right? And to send them to college so that they don't have to live in Chinatown.
Right.
Or the parents themselves will eventually save up the money that they make in their restaurant and buy a house in the suburbs. There's a lot of people who just don't want to live in the city. It's not the healthiest place to live, and so on.
Yeah, although the overall demographics in the US, there has been a shift to the city from the suburbs. I think COVID-19 might have upended that, but we look at the last 10, 20 years, I think the move has been toward the city, right?
That's possible too. I think there's a lot of reasons, which I'm not an expert on at all. Some people get bored with suburb life. Some people like the hustle and bustle of the city. There's certainly more jobs in the city.
It's also the young people. They seem to be, there is a sort of a demographic shift in the city.
Right. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see what, I think young, let's say you're a couple years, you're graduating college and you get a job in Boston or New York or Philadelphia. It's an exciting time of your life, right? To live in the city and do city things. Is that what you're going to do when you have 3 kids? It's hard to say.
It gets expensive.
It's very expensive, yes. And then the school systems, and all of that you have to deal with.
Right. But there hasn't been any move to sort of relocate Chinatowns away from the city into the suburbs, right?
I don't think so. I mean, I have to admit that I've not been to New York City in quite a while, and I'm only used to the original Chinatown that was in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Right. And so I understand that there's like a Flushing, Queens Chinatown, there's a Brooklyn Chinatown, so there's new Chinatowns because there's always new Chinese.
Right. Excellent. So we'll take a quick break, Scott. When we come back, we'll talk about your other paper, the Boston downgrade. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back, Scott. We are talking about immigration to the U.S., different waves of immigration that happened over the last 200, 250 years, and different criteria that was used for awarding citizenships. And then we were talking about this phenomenon, Chinatown, which is not necessarily an American phenomenon, but it's worldwide. and how Chinatowns, sort of the intent, original intent of the Chinatown, perhaps it's changing now. You have another paper. This is about a specific incident. It's about a 1903 Boston Chinatown raid. You say the combined police and immigration raid on Boston Chinatown in 1903 is fairly well known among scholars of Chinese American history. It's often cited as an example of continued police harassment of the community well after the passage of the original Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. We talked a bit about that. So this was sort of an enforcement act in Boston Chinatown?
Yeah, what happened, and if I can take the time to sort of explain how I've explored this, a number of people had talked about this raid, and that that the police and what I guess was then, I don't know if it was called the INS yet, but the feds, they raided Chinatown to see if there were people who were illegals, right? But what happened was that, some people listed the raid as happening in 1902. Some people said it was 1904, and some people said it was 1903. And I simply wanted to mention it in my dissertation. But I was determined to get the right year. Okay. So what I did was I ordered on microfilm the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. And I went through them quickly to look for the raid, and it wasn't in 1902 and it wasn't in 1904, but I found it in 1903.
October 12, it says here, 1903.
Yeah. And so, I found the raid, but then something told me, well, go back a couple weeks before the raid. Let's just see what's going on in Boston. And that's when I just find out that there's a murder that takes place. There's like between two competing factions in Chinatown, right? And there's a murder, and then there's going to be a funeral. And so the police, I think, the way I read this was that the police said, well, there's going to be a funeral. What a great time to round up as many illegal Chinese as we can.
Right.
So indeed, they go and raid Chinatown. They go to the restaurants and they go to various places the night of the funeral. Right. And they arrest anyone because in 1902, the government had passed an extension of the Exclusion Act. See, the Exclusion Act was 1882, supposedly for 10 years. Well, it gets renewed in 1893. Okay. And then it gets renewed again in 1902. Right. And so in 1903, they say, well, there's still all these illegal Chinese. Let's have a raid and round them up. So they round all these people up, and then they put them in jail, and they come to realize that, well, actually, a lot of these people, some of them are American born, so we can't arrest them. And they actually do have their correct documents, but they don't carry them on them, right? And it would be like you and I having to carry our passports all the time.
Right.
And, most people didn't. I don't carry my passport because I don't want to lose it, right? And so the Chinese didn't want to carry their legal papers because they didn't want to lose them either. But because they didn't have them, they got arrested. And so what I found fascinating for me was that as I was reading through the newspaper accounts of both the murder and then the raid, was the aftermath of there's a couple cases in the newspapers in which Irish women go to bail out their Chinese husbands. Right. And so I said, oh, well, this is fascinating. Right. And what was fascinating to me about it is because although of a different generation, my mother, who was born in 1925 in Philadelphia, Chinatown, eventually 3 of her brothers will marry Irish women. Irish American women, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, wow, so that's in Philadelphia. I know this is going on in the 20s. And here in 1903, this is going on in Boston. And then I have a friend who wrote about Irish Chinese marriages in New York City, Chinatown as well. So then I was, that was one thing I was interested in was, to show that Chinatowns were not purely Chinese, but that there was interracial marriage going on at this time. And I didn't venture into why, because I don't know why. I have my ideas about it. I think one is that Irish were the one group that slightly more women than men immigrated.
Yeah.
Right. And then Chinese not allowed to bring their wives or bring women, or they were single men and there were no other Chinese women around. They looking for companionship, and they're all living in the same area. They bump into each other and they eventually form relationships and some get married.
There was no sort of citizenship advantages?
Not necessarily. I guess because men would not derive their citizenship from their wives.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I still believe that an ulterior motive of restricting marriages for Chinese was to cut down on American-born Chinese. That they didn't want them to have the vote.
Yeah, I remember, maybe it was in your talk, if I understood it correctly. If you are a woman and you have American citizenship, and if you married somebody who does not have American citizenship, you lose yours?
Yes, and that would be in the 1930s.
In the 1930s.
Yeah, the Cable Act.
Right.
Or I think that's the Cable Act's in the 30s, I think. And that stated that if an American woman who was a citizen married someone who was ineligible to become a citizen, she would lose her citizenship. But if the marriage was terminated by death or divorce, a white woman could reapply for her citizenship. But the Chinese woman would fall back into that category of being ineligible for a citizenship.
Right. And so this was the paper Boston Herald says that over 300 Chinamen arrested in a big roundup by police. So this was a sort of big arrest. It says that the bail was set at $500. Seems like at $500, not many can afford in 1903 $500, I would imagine, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think only 50 of them were found to be illegal.
Only 50 out of 300. Yeah.
And I just checked my phone. The Cable Act is actually 1922.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so in addition, we know the motivation for the raid. We know sort of the outcomes of the raid. Did this sort of start a series of this type of stuff going on? It sounds a bit like the sanctuary city issue that we run into now, right? It just sounds.
Yeah. There were other raids that followed this, but not as big. And I think there was one in Pittsburgh. There may have been one in Detroit, but I'm not sure. But there were other raids, but none of them that large, I don't think.
Yeah. And when was the Exclusionary Act came to an end?
1943.
1943. Wow. Okay.
Because the U.S. and China are allies in the war.
Right.
And it became increasingly difficult to tell the Chinese they couldn't come to the U.S. even though we were allies, right? Yeah. And the Japanese were using exclusion as a propaganda tool, right? The Japanese were, like when they would drop leaflets over China or they would broadcast propaganda radio, they would say, "Come on now, you Chinese, how can you be allies with America when they don't even let you go to their country?" right?
Yeah.
You should join us. And there were some American politicians who were naive enough to believe that the Chinese might change sides, you know, not sort of taking into account that the Chinese by the 1930s, there was no way that they were going to join Japan, because of the atrocities that the Japanese had committed. But what's also interesting too about the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, most of the public speaking and the publicity were not done by Chinese Americans, but by prominent white people, such as Pearl Buck.
Yeah.
Right. And that was a strategy of saying, like, let us do it so that you don't look like you're complaining.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like, Scott, we need a war to end
That's right.
to end racism.
Right.
And so in conclusion, I want to I don't obviously don't want to go into politics, but I want to get your sort of at least intuition. Where do you think we are today? It appeared to me we had a president who seems to advocate systemic racism just very recently. Half the country voted for him. Do you think we have moved on, or are we sort of circling around the same ideas?
That's a good question. I spoke earlier today about this. We have definitely moved. Race relations have in many ways certainly improved, right? I think the former president and COVID made us all take a step back because of his anti-Asian rhetoric and blaming China for the pandemic. And there's been an uptick in anti-Asian violence.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't think, and I said this earlier, I'm not sure if we would be speaking so much about anti-Asian violence if it wasn't for the death of George Floyd. Right. The fact that anti-Black violence had reached a point where people were so obviously being killed,
right,
on videotape, on TV, that when the Chinese get attacked in New York City because of COVID, that news story is going to get picked up, But I am confident. Let's put it this way. I fully acknowledge that we have, a racist past and present and probably future.
Yeah.
Right. But things have come a long way. And I don't want to sound naive about that, but, people of different races are allowed to marry each other. Right? It may not be approved by everybody, but it took till 1967 for that to become the law of the land, that people of other races could marry each other.
Yeah.
I know this may sound totally naive, but I watch enough TV that I am still struck by the amount of mixed race couples in commercials and as characters in TV shows, the same as I'm struck by how many, although they don't make a point about it, but it's obvious that there are gay and lesbian couples in commercials, Now, whether we're going to gauge racial progress by representation in commercials is a pretty shallow way of looking at it, perhaps, but the fact that the imagery is there is quite different than in the past,
It's a measurement. So one thing I worry about, Scott, I don't know if you agree with this, is that obviously, so the African American violent, the police violence against them, issues that we ran into with George Floyd's death and so on. It showcases the issue, but I wonder if it also desensitizes. When you see more, I wonder if you are getting desensitized to the issue. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that if as more African Americans or more people of color are either brutalized by the police or by other citizens, that we do become desensitized. I mean, look how many fellow Americans we have lost to COVID.
Yeah.
Right? Over 500,000. And yet it's so hard for Americans to stop and mourn that. You know, like individuals mourn their losses, but we as a country haven't yet like taken the time to stop and say, oh my God, look what happened to us, you know?
Yeah.
Instead, we go to look for someone to blame, or we get upset because we have to wear a mask, you know? and then you have idiots in Congress who think wearing a mask is similar to the Holocaust, you know? I mean, like, well, what do you say to that? You know? So yeah, we are desensitized, you know, in some ways. Like, oh, it's just another killing.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to close with this. I don't know the exact quote, but a former presidential candidate said something like, you know, there is no Native American culture.
Oh, yes.
In the US culture, right? It's very symptomatic of, I believe, how people think, right? Most people don't say things like that, but sometimes it comes out. And so when things like that come out, you have to wonder if, you know, the issue exists in the system. You know, it's just sleeping.
No, it is, you know, and I'm not, you know, I know what the guy you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I guess he thinks, you know, the epitome of culture are like big cities like Paris or something, you know, or New York City, you know, and I mean, at that time, you know, Native American culture, when Columbus gets here, no, there's no Florence, there's no Venice here, right? But there's a rich culture just happening in a different way, you know?
Right. Yeah. I guess, you know, in my view, it remains to be seen. Most people don't really have time to think about these issues. But I used to say, and I was completely wrong on this, Scott. I used to say there is no point looking back. History is not really going to tell us much about how to design the future. But that is not true anymore. Right? That is not. I know that it's not true. The last 10 years have been, you know, really eye-opening in many ways, actually.
Yeah. No, it's true. I think for some people, there is no history. There is no past. There's nothing to learn from. We just keep moving forward, you know. And then, unfortunately, there are the people who are the opposite, who want everything to be like it used to be, or what they think it used to be, you know. There's a historian, David Blight, who teaches at Yale, and he says, you know, Americans they want to hear the same old song over and over again, the same way they've always heard it. You know, they don't want a new version of that same song, you know.
Yeah. It's nostalgic, maybe.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Scott. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me, Gill.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.